Dave, he had been working for a magazine called Walking Magazine, and he was researching the trail systems, the big long trail systems of the United States. Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail. You've probably heard of these. One that he talked to me about was this thing called the Continental Divide Trail. And at that time, back in the late 80s, very few people had done it. And so he came to me with the idea of let's spend some time hiking. So we were all at a place in our lives where we had gotten out of college recently. We had jobs, but they weren't jobs that felt like they were going to last forever. He was working for a magazine. I was working for a magazine. Our friend was studying our friend on the left is Townsend. I'm in the middle, and my friend Dave is on the right. And we were all at places in our lives where we could take a pretty big chunk of time off. We're all thinking about graduate school and doing something else. So we all committed to meet up in Boulder, Colorado. And then friends and family drove us down to the border. This is at the border. You can see the Mexican flag off in the distance. And it's a place called Antelope Wells. It's kind of an entry point. And we spent our first day actually hiking south. We had to drive into a spot and then go south. This is the border fence in Mexico. And I'll apologize. These images were scanned from old slides, and they're a little bit blurry and a little bit color distorted, but hopefully you'll get the sense. And if you need to make the images smaller on your screen, that probably will make them look better because the big ones are going to be a little diluted. But you can see we're on the border fence. And if you look in the background, I don't know if you can tell, but the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the grassland behind us is different colors, and that's because of grazing, highly grazed on the US side. What we learned in New Mexico as we started off on this journey was it's a really dry place. There are no surface streams of any kind. So every day our hunt was for these windmills, because the windmills are pumping water out of the ground into these little tanks at the base. And so our drinking supply was really closely tied to these windmills and these tanks. We usually didn't drink out of the tanks after we swam in them. We'd actually pull water out of the windmills, had these little faucets that went right into our canteens. But these tanks had goldfish and other stuff. But soon enough, within about 10 days or so, we were further up in New Mexico, and we're on the Gila River system. The Gila flows west towards the Colorado River and California, but in this headwaters area, it has quite a bit of water. So we did a couple days of hiking on the Gila where we crossed the stream over 100 times. The first of those, we actually took our boots off, to keep our boots dry, but soon enough, we realized that wasn't going to work. And about 2.5 weeks into our trip, we had one of our second food drops, and we had about 15 of these food drops where we'd resupply with food and film for our cameras. That's right, back then we had film for the cameras and white gas for our stoves. And this food drop was in a town called Pie Town. It's in New Mexico. It used to be a popular thoroughfare, but then with new highways, it basically became a real backwater. This is a guy named Lester Jackson, and he just welcomed us into his house. This happened over and over again. You can't believe how often people would just be like, "What are you guys doing?" "Well, we're hiking across the country." "Well, that sounds interesting. Come on in." And so he brought us into his house. We stayed there a couple nights. He was fond of saying, "I haven't had so much fun since the hogs ate my brother." And he was just kind of a character, an ex-Marine, but just really, really nice guy. And soon enough, just a few more days or a week later, we're starting to get into higher elevation terrain in New Mexico. And this is a little wilderness area just east of the town of Cuba. And we went up and we broke out for the first time our snowshoes. We had these fiberglass snowshoes, which enabled us to hike across the snow. And the first day we wore them was also the first day we had to start repairing them with duct tape. But it was quite a lot of variety. And, before we know it, just 6 weeks into the trip, it's certainly the longest hiking I'd ever done. But we managed to cross our first border. This is looking back towards New Mexico from our entry point into Colorado. And that start date was back in March 10th. And here we are 637 miles later on April 23rd. So one of the things we learned, the borders are just arbitrary. The state borders, the fence lines, the ownership lines, at least for hiking purposes, you didn't like the borders, you didn't like the fences. It's a pain to carry your pack and lift it over a barbed wire fence. But we did also learn, just even in this first month, that people are really welcoming. They'll bring you in and let you know that you can hang out for a few days.
Hear me?
Go ahead.
Can you explain the Continental Divide because they may not know what
Yeah,
that is?
sure. That's a great question. So running up the middle of the West is the dividing line between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean drainages. And so running through, hopefully all these states are familiar, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and then Idaho, Montana. On the west side of that line is all streams, river systems that flow into the Pacific Ocean. And on the east side are all these tributaries that flow into the Missouri and the Mississippi and the Platte River. So that's the continental divide. You've probably heard that term, but that's exactly what it does. It divides the continent as far as the watershed. And you'll see that weird little circle up there. And I'll talk about that later. That's in Wyoming. It's called the Red Desert. It's actually a place where the rain and snow falling in there doesn't go anywhere. It just goes into this basin. Thanks for that good question. And feel free if there's any big picture questions to interrupt. As we started into Colorado, it was a lot higher elevation. We're on a lot of snow. And we both look pretty concerned because we're in a valley where there's some small scale avalanches happening. But soon enough, we got up and out of that. And there's some really spectacular country. This is in the southern part of the state called the San Juans. So we're doing a lot of travel by snowshoe. We had snow shovels for digging pits. And this place is actually called Snow Mesa. It's a big expanse, pretty much flat, so easy hiking, but you had to dig in. And this is probably one of the colder places on the whole trip. It might have gotten down into the 10 or 15 degrees at night. But the good news is starting a trip in March, and by the time we're here in Colorado, this is getting towards May 1st, the weather's starting to heat up. So it's spring in the air, but snow on the ground, winter on the ground. Things sometimes get wet. So this is one thing we might do is drape our sleeping bags over the trees or otherwise just to keep them dry. And in some of these valleys, this is a place called Cochetopa Creek. We saw these clear cutting and we're like, what the heck came through here? Like every aspen tree is leveled to the ground. And it was beaver dams like the one you see down here on the left, and the Beaver Lodge, which is kind of center in the middle. They're pretty active tree cutters. And they do a pretty good job. They create a lot of habitat. These ponds are full of brook trout and help kind of moderate how the snow makes its way down these valleys. We had a lot of help from family and friends. That's me on the right, Townsend in the middle, just off my shoulder. And then Dave and his mom, Val Havlick. She's a biology professor, teacher in the local school system here in Boulder, but they would meet up with us. Some of our food we sent ahead in big boxes. They would wait for us at different post offices, but a lot of our food drops were actually family and friends arriving. We had done all this packaging ahead of time, and they would bring us supplies. Some of the stuff you see here, if you look on the apricot nectar, that big can, we did not carry cans, but we did carry a lot of ridiculously heavy stuff. We have big bags of granola and gorp. We had 4 basic dinners, including mac and cheese and rice-a-roni with hamburger helper. So we got a little tired of our food sources because we packed them ahead of time and weren't very creative about it. And in Colorado, partway through, we started coinciding with the Colorado Trail. The Colorado Trail runs about 500 miles from Durango in the southwest of Colorado to the city of Denver, which is kind of middle, a little farther north and close to where I live right now. And so the Continental Divide Trail and the Colorado Trail overlap for a couple hundred miles. There's some amazing stuff if you're out in the woods, right? This is the headwaters of the Taylor River, which flows into the Gunnison, which flows into the Colorado. But you're fishing in places where no one else is around because it's still kind of pretty snowy. A lot of the roads and access to these places is limited. And we did carry fishing poles as well as snow shovels and snowshoes. So things were heavy. And right around this time, we're getting closer and closer to my hometown of Boulder. And this is ridge lines. The Continental Divide has a lot of ridge hiking. You don't always stay on the ridges, but you do keep close to them. And you can see here the wind is blowing. This image is looking south. The wind is blowing from the west and creating these giant cornices of snow. Those are several feet thick on the eastern and left side of the screen there. That's a picture of Nate, who's guiding your Spring of Sage course. A little blurry, sorry about that. But Nate joined our trek for about 10 days and did a pretty amazing backpack trip all inside that time frame, including sleeping out on the ground. This is a night we didn't pitch the tent. And we're just in our backyard. Basically, this is 20 miles as the crow flies from where I'm sitting right now in Boulder. So getting really close to my backyard. And one of the takeaways from a big long trip like that is there are places you go through that you really want to go back through again. And so this is in Rocky Mountain Park, just north and west of Boulder. That's Long's Peak on the left. That has a really flat top. And the valley there is called Glacier Gorge. And it's a place I've gone back to dozens of times since, one of the more spectacular spots. Another real blurry image just to show that we did cook on stoves, small stoves. We had a small pot set. We didn't use fire very much at all. This is one of the few times we were actually with a bigger group. Dave Havlick's parents had come to join us for a couple days. And the only times we'd have fires was either a special occasion like having friends, or if we got really wet. If we got totally soaking wet from snow or water from rain, we might have a fire to dry things out. So I'd say maybe 1 out of every 15 days we'd have a fire. That was pretty uncommon. And sure enough, here more than I guess April, May, June, we're 3 months in to the trip, and we've gone almost 1,500 miles, and we've gotten through New Mexico and Colorado. Now we're going into that little loop I was talking about earlier. That's the Red Desert, and the trail system as such, you could either go on the eastern flank or the western flank, or you could go right through the middle of it. And it's the middle that we ended up taking. So this is one of our last high points. We just exited Colorado into Wyoming. You see that big snowbank. It's right around end of June at this point, and we're keeping pretty meticulous notes. We all journaled. We all took some notes down, which is great. For me, I'm a kind of a visual learner, so writing it helped me remember the names of campsites and passes and roads and different things we did. But we were trekking through some pretty dry countryside, and much like New Mexico, southern Wyoming had very little surface water, and we relied a lot on stock tanks or windmills or springs. And this is a guy we met. We actually dropped off a food box with him back to the winter prior to the trip. His name is Marvin Killian, and that's one of his pigs. He actually named his pigs. This one was called Oink Oink. It's like a 500-pounder. And he actually, when we arrived, he was kind of shocked. He said, "I thought you were dead," because about 3 or 4 weeks earlier, there had been a big blizzard in Colorado, and 3 hikers who were going through Colorado got caught up in that storm, and a couple of them died. One, I think, fell, and another died of exposure. Just randomly, we experienced that storm, but it turned out to be a time where we were low elevation and it was not a problem. But he was actually expecting we would never show up and he would be able to give away our food box. But we're at his gas station on Interstate 80 and met a few of his buddies, kind of the regulars. He had a gas station and a bar, and he talked long into the afternoon with us. And one of his patrons said, "Hey, you guys need a place to sleep?" And sure enough, we slept on a lush green lawn in the middle of the Red Desert. After about 4 or 5 days of going through this sagebrush, we were getting closer and closer to what you see in the background, which is the Wind River Range. But before we got there, we saw some of these signs for the Oregon Trail. So folks have probably heard about some of the big trails that went east to west as white settlers were coming further and further west. And this is one of the spots where the Oregon Trail passed through. So some of the same roads we were walking on were wagon trains long before us. This is a terrible shot, but I included it because it was after 5 days in the desert. This was the Sweetwater River. And if my friend Townsend emailed me as recently as a couple of weeks ago saying, I remember the Sweetwater River. As soon as we got into the Wind River Range, just past that Sweetwater River, the mosquitoes came out in force. And again, another real blurry image, but it was really a nice summer day. It was like 70 degrees. You'd normally want to have shorts and a t-shirt, but the mosquitoes were relentless. And they're like that in the Wind Rivers today. It's a beautiful mountain range, but significant mosquitoes. One of the benefits of mosquitoes is they are food supply for a lot of other critters like this cutthroat trout. Dave actually caught this one with his bare hands in a stream. It was spawning from a lake up into a stream. That's probably not the right way to catch fish, but we were at this point occasionally having fish for dinner. We did have fishing licenses, so it was kosher, but you're supposed to catch them with flies. So that's the Wind River Range in the background. Spectacular. We're kind of hiking on a trail that took us above tree line and below tree line. But now we're right around July 4th, and it's amazing how much snow is still around, how much moisture is around, and how many mosquitoes are around. This is an image of what your feet might look like at the end of a long day, especially if it's a wet day. Those are all like super pruned out, disgustingly gross feet. And I'm sorry to show you this image, but that's what sometimes your feet look like. And as we got towards the northern end of Wyoming, this is a place called Togety Pass. And we met up with Townsend's father, the guy in the middle with the white, light colored blue shirt. His father and his father's friend in the red hunter shirt, they met us and wanted to go hiking with us. So they brought their backpacks, and we set out from Trailhead, freshly supplied with new food. And we got about 4 miles in, and they were wiped out. They stopped for a rest. They fell asleep, and we ended up having a campsite right here. It's one of our shortest days. It was about 3.5 miles. And at that point, Townsend, with the red ball cap on the left, Townsend had to go back east. He was starting graduate school at MIT in physics, which is a profession he's followed to today. But this was our last day with Townsend. He had some issues earlier in the trip with ankle and knee problems, so he'd had to miss a couple other weeks. But this is when he actually left. And for the rest of the trip, it was me and Dave. This is a shot of, it's a log that's actually kind of wet, that you're crossing a stream, and it seems ridiculously dangerous, but it was really the safest or only way to cross that stream, which still had tons of water in it in early July. And that same stream a little further down, or a stream right nearby it, was actually a stream that hits this tree and splits. And you can see, if you can read the sign, it has the distance to the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and the same water kind of breaks around that tree. Another day took us into Yellowstone, and you are not old enough to remember it, but Yellowstone had a fire back in 1988, a couple of years before we did this trip. And parts of the park, literally about 1 million acres, nearly, I think 40% of the park was fire damaged. And so this is what we had to hike through, some of the sections, and you can see that green plant. That's a fireweed. It's one of the first plants that comes back. And we, of course, went by Old Faithful, because it's hard not to. And we enjoyed watching Old Faithful with like 500 other people who were there. So being in the wilderness 1 second, and then being in the middle of humanity. And just west of Yellowstone, there's a town of West Yellowstone, and just west of there, there's the border. And for the next 100 miles or so, the Continental Divide actually follows the border between Idaho on the west and Montana on the east. And so we follow that divide. We're getting to be pretty grizzled, long beards, shaggy beards, clothing that's hasn't had a real wash. We tried to wash it in streams, and when we went into town, things were starting to break down a little bit. And Dave wore this shirt almost every day on the trip. It has different types of animal scat. And here he's picking up and finding an example, trying to identify the scat he found with some image on his shirt. One of the best parts of the trip were when people would join us. Bumping into new people and making friends was great, but also having, in this case, a guy on the right, Paul Casella, who is a college roommate of Dave, and his younger brother in the middle. His younger brother has the dirtiest pants I've ever seen, and he'd only been with us for a day. So I don't know. It wasn't always the case that you get that grungy, but they joined us. And in Montana, we started seeing stuff we hadn't really seen before. This is called bear grass. It's a plant, a flower that grows in these tall stalks. They're 3 or 4 feet tall, have all these little petals at the top. This is a Indian paintbrush and lupin, pretty common plant all across the West. But we, even in August here, we're seeing lots of beautiful flowers. And this is entering into the Scapegoat Wilderness, which itself had a big fire back in the 80s. And just after you leave the Scapegoat, headed north, you hit the Bob Marshall. I don't know if folks have ever heard of that, but that's a big, extensive wilderness area, really remote. I've been back there once or twice since. Lots of wolves and black bear, and pretty wild place, and a lot of horses. This kind of trail damage is usually from horses, because it has this, they have uniform strides. And so they'll have these little, you'll see these little ditches kind of every foot or so, and they can kind of wreak havoc. So a lot of horse packers take trips into the Bob Marshall, and the wet, nasty days are complemented by some pretty nice days. When the sun finally comes out, it can be really nice. This is the tail end of a feature called the Great Chinese Wall, which is a limestone feature that runs for about 20 miles, and the trail runs right along the base of it. Once you leave the Bob Marshall, you're just a day away from the final section of the trip, which is Glacier National Park. We use maps like this one. It's a topographical map put out by the U.S. Geologic Survey. Hopefully you've seen these. You'll be introduced to them during your Spring and Sage. But we use them pretty often. This is before cell phones. This is before any widespread GIS use, GPS use. So we're really using paper maps, and we had gathered all those maps ahead of the trip, done a lot of research ahead of time, tried to figure out how far we were going to go each day, kind of charted out where the food drops could be. But we brought these maps along with us and had a new batch of maps in each of our food supply or our drop boxes. And this is a map of Glacier Park. Glacier Park was really, really rainy, at least for the first part of it. Dave's looks like at the end of a long day here. About 10 minutes after this shot, though, we saw a grizzly bear in the wild, and that was probably one of the most exciting things in my life. Luckily, that grizzly bear was freaked out to see us. As soon as it caught our smell, he kind of stood up on his hind legs and ran away from us as fast as he could. And one of the only 3 or 4 times I've ever seen a grizzly, and it was amazing to see it. One of the reasons the grizzly was there, he was eating berries. We saw piles of these huckleberries on the trail. The bear had eaten them and digested them quickly, or we always thought when we saw a pile of steaming berries, we thought, oh no, he discharged the berries because he smelled us, and he knew we'd be better eaten. And the ranger at one point in Yellowstone said, you don't have to be able to outrun the bear, you have to be able to outrun your buddy. So we usually joked about that. Glacier Park, if you haven't been to Glacier, it's spectacular. It's limestone for the most part. It has some glaciers, appropriately named. Of course, this is 30 years ago, and many of the glaciers have probably melted significantly since then, but a lot of water. And then before you know it, you're on a big lake, and you're looking into Canada. And this is Waterton Lake. It's shared by the United States and Canada, and it's part of the national park. The park actually goes up into Canada as well. And we're at this point 5.5 kilometers from the international boundary. We had hoped on our last day to go up and stay on a ridge line, but the weather that morning had a cloud ceiling down at 7,000 feet, and you couldn't see anything, and we really couldn't even find a way to get up onto the ridge line. It would have been too dangerous, I think, anyway. But we got to the marker. My grandmother had sent a care package to our last food drop with balloons and various toys, so we celebrated at the border and said goodbye to the Continental Divide Trail. My boots here, this is the second to last slide. When I was hiking with Nate, the portion of the trail that Nate joined back in Colorado, one day we're kind of warming ourselves by a fire, and my boots got a little too close, and we're kind of the sole started getting a little loose and flappy. It wasn't terrible, but I did have to tie the boots up for the next couple thousand miles. But they were still mostly good boots, so I didn't buy another pair. And that is it. Thanks for letting me go at such length, and I'd be happy to circle back to any of those slides. I realize there's plenty of things I left out that you might be interested in hearing about, so I'd love to answer any questions that I can.
Thanks, Bart. The slides are actually showed up really well for us. So
awesome. Well, good. I'm glad. It was those called 35 millimeter slide film, and I don't even think that exists anymore. Kodak made it way back in the day, but I managed to scan a few in. So glad I could share those with you.
Bart, I have a question. Dan, hey. Now, 31 years later, was there one particular place or one particular day that like stands out in your mind the most, or is it more like you just get kind of little flashes of memories?
It's pretty much the latter, right? We were out in the field for close to 170 days. And so there's so many of them. There's so many highlights and lowlights, right? So I can't really remember. I'm not drawn to a single episode. But there was a time I had a pretty good memory for the first 5 or 10 years after the trip. I could almost remember every campsite. And in part, I think that's because if you're doing something like this, that's so unique, so different than normal. It's not like school. It's not like hanging around the house. It's not anything like you've done before, that it does really create these memories, these really tight memories. So rather than a single memory, I think as you said, I had more like flashes of like, oh, this is reminding me of this place in New Mexico that I went 30 years ago. So it's more of that. It's more hundreds and hundreds of smaller memories.
Cool, awesome.
Feel free to ask anything you're curious about, guys. I have lots of questions, but I'll wait.
Was there any time along it where you kind of felt like stopping, or you wanted to stop going, I guess?
Yeah, like stopping the trip altogether. I don't think it's funny. I don't think I felt that strongly, but the first week of the trip was really hard mentally. Like we were starting off on a thing we knew was going to take a long time because we had mapped it out. We even created a little date itinerary, where we thought we'd be at this place at this time. So we kind of knew that we were going to be out in the woods for 25 weeks, which is almost 6 months. And that mentally, when you're starting a trip of that length, it was very hard to comprehend. I was like, oh my God, what are we doing? But at age 24, I was strong, physically strong. There was nothing wrong. It's not like I couldn't walk another mile. I couldn't, find a way to get the water. So that kind of pushing through that mental challenge was really only hardest in the first week or two. And after we got to our first food drop in the town of Silver City, and we got care packet, the people had sent us stuff in the mail, like books to read and candy, and we got resupplied with all the food we're going to eat. That was like a pretty good milestone, and it kind of seemed more feasible. The mental piece of it got away. But I think for our friend Townsend, who also goes by TZ, his last name is Zwart. So Townsend Zwart, he actually had some biomechanical issues. He had some really weak ankles and he had some knee problems. And so he actually did have to quit the trip for a couple weeks here and there. Like he'd go to a resupply and say, guys, I got to take a week off. And luckily we had some friends that he stayed with in New Mexico. So he wasn't like camping out in the park, but he was able to go visit and recover. And so for him, I've talked to him a little bit about this. He did have to stop, quit the trip a couple different times, but he was always attracted to come back. So he'd rest up for a week. He'd feel better, stronger. He was doing strengthening exercises and he'd rejoin us. And he actually, to his credit, he made it all the way to Yellowstone before he had to go back to graduate school. So long and the short is I think there's a lot that you think about quitting that's uncomfortable, but there's also some stuff that keeps you going and getting, finishing a week, the first week of the first state, you start hitting some milestones and they really kind of motivate you to continue to see what's around the next corner.
What was your average day in terms of miles and time, and maybe your longest and shortest too?
Yeah. The very shortest days were after we got resupplied. When we got a brand new supply of food and fuel, our packs were weighing at least 65 or 70 pounds and sometimes more, which by today's standards, right, for all of you that are camping or planning to camp, everything's gotten lighter. The food's gotten lighter, the stoves, all the gear. So like, there's no excuse for going out with a pack more than 50 pounds today. But we had heavy gear and we were also trying to carry a week or 10 days of food. So those days when we resupplied, we only go 4 miles maybe. And that would take, that might take 4 or 5 hours. We might go really slowly, rest, put the pack down. But it's amazing what your body can get used to. So our average day was something in the neighborhood of 16 or 17 miles, which is a lot of miles. But interestingly, it's all we're doing. It's our full-time job. We wake up in the morning, we have breakfast, and then our job that day is to head north. And so it's a lot of miles, but you break it into, 2 miles an hour or 1.5 miles an hour. And so, after 10 hours, you've gone your 15 miles. The very longest days we did were on flat sections in New Mexico, Wyoming, and even in a bit of Montana. and we could go as far as 24, 25 miles in a day. I know today people who go light, who have the Go Light gear, the people that do the Pacific Crest Trail for time, and there's a lot of people who do that trail really fast. They're going 25 miles every single day, and maybe more. So that's that. Even though for us that was the maximum, for a lot of people today with lighter gear, they're kind of averaging 25 miles a day.
And do you take intentional rest days or just as needed, or how'd that happen?
Yeah, I think going into the trip, we thought we were going to take rest days in the middle of the woods. Like, hey, this is a beautiful lake. Let's just hang out here for a day. Let's not do any more moving. Let's go fishing and whatever. But it's funny, we didn't end up taking the places we took rest days were when we went into town to resupply, to meet up with a friend or family member. So the rest days we took were the ones where we were able to gorge ourselves on food, like buy a big bag of corn chips, let's buy cans of peaches, let's just kind of catch up. And so that's where we ended up taking our rest days. I don't think we actually ever had a full rest day in the middle of the woods. It was only when we came into town. So that was a big surprise, I guess.
Taylor, you had a question?
I was going to ask the same question about what was the longest that you would travel one day, but you answered that.
So. Yeah, it was.
Mark,
yeah, go ahead.
Was there ever a place where, without cell phone and, that wasn't even in your mind, obviously, but where things were a little dangerous and you were thinking like an injury could be a real game changer with not many people around? Were there any river crossings or obviously the grizzly bear where you guys were worried about the being injured, 100 miles from anyone?
Yeah, it certainly crossed our mind, but it's funny because if you take yourself back in time to 1990, without cell phone, without GPS being used widely, and with, not that much, we're going through really wildernessy areas, right? Where there weren't a lot of roads, there weren't a lot of towns. And so it wasn't really on our mind that we could have been safer or that we could have had contact with the outside world. And so it wasn't like we felt like we were missing out on that. But you're right, there was this feeling like if you have a heavy pack, you're in the middle of nowhere, you're literally 5 or 10 miles from the nearest trailhead where there might be a car or an emergency vehicle, and you're walking on, kind of a boulder field where it's either slippery or rocky. It does cross your mind, like, if I break an ankle here, I'm going to be in trouble. We did have, most of the time we're near some water source. We carried some water, and being in a group of 2 or 3, which we were, there was always a little bit of the, my buddy will either help carry me out of here, carry me down to a stream, go get help. I think if I had done this trip solo, I would have been much more aware or concerned about rattlesnake bites, falling off a little cliff, twisting an ankle or whatever. But it wasn't, I'd say short answer is, didn't occupy my mind every day. I wasn't really constantly worried about getting hurt. I did actually sprain my ankle pretty severely one day. I might have had a little fracture. I'm not sure. I just I didn't want to quit the trip. It didn't hurt that badly. So I just laced up my boots pretty tight and, kept hiking. And 10 days later, it hurt a lot less. So, but luckily, other than Townsend, we were fortunate not to have any major knee or ankle or other problems. So we did plenty of falling. Townsend, in the first week of the trip, Townsend had a couple times he just tripped, fell off the trail, into a cactus and punctured his thermarest. He did that at least once, and luckily we had a patch kit and stuff, so no harm done.
Whose idea was it at first to walk from, Mexico to Canada, and how long did the planning take from there? Yeah, so the idea was pretty much from Dave Havlick, my buddy. He's a year ahead of me in college. I went to the same high school as Dave. And because he was doing this internship with Walking Magazine, he was starting to research about the trails, the big long trails in the United States. And so I think both of us, he had that job, which is kind of part-time, or he knew it wasn't going to last more than 6 months. I was working for Runner's World magazine in Pennsylvania, and I was on a, week-to-week or month-to-month contract. It wasn't like I was going to be hired full-time. And so we're both interested in, we're working, we're thinking about graduate school, but we're not, we had some freedom in thought. And so he
he had told me about these trails. He's like, hey, the Continental Divide Trail, that looks like an interesting one. And so it was really kind of his idea. As far as the planning and organizing, there was a lot. Like you think about a 6-month trip, it's all the basic things that you do if you're going on a week-long backpack or a 5-day backpack. You know, you need a backpack, a tent, you need food, a stove. It's all the same stuff, but you do have to think much bigger logistically. Like, you know, you had to plan ahead. We didn't want to have to buy food in every town and every grocery store. In fact, we weren't sure how close we'd be to grocery stores. So we did a lot of the planning ahead. It was probably the better part of a month, almost full time, between buying the maps, charting out the course. We had to make these giant food boxes with the granola and the gorp and the oatmeal and the mac and cheese for dinner. We had to make those boxes, and then we had to drop them off. We either mailed them. You could actually mail general delivery, send it to a post office. It would just wait there for you. But we actually drove to places where we didn't know if there'd be a post office. We took a road trip in February, right before the trip, and dropped them off at like Marvin Killian's gas station and a little town called Gibbonsville, Idaho. We dropped the boxes off there. And then, you know, we did some gear. We did a little overnight kind of setting everything up. We got some gear from friends, but it was, you know, we were planning over the course of 2.5 months, but actual time planning, actual work planning and getting everything together was probably at least 3 or 4 solid weeks. So that's a fair chunk of time, but it pays off. I think through that, reading the maps and kind of estimating the distances, we were able to make that little table. And going to a prior question, because we didn't have cell phone service and couldn't easily reach out to people, we could call people when we got to town, right? Go to a payphone or borrow someone's house phone. But we had to have a pretty good sense of where we'd be and when for people to meet up with us. And luckily, that led to us taking some shortcuts. You know, sometimes we could have stayed on the trail, but we ended up just staying on the road. And we just hiked, you know, the last 10 miles on a highway or on a dirt road instead of being on a trail, because we needed to get to the next food drop or we had, you know, the next checkpoint. So it wasn't completely free. We had to fit with some schedules that we had created.
Did you make any real big errors in your planning, logistics, calculations in terms of food drops or equipment or anything where you like, oh, we really screwed this up?
Well, yes and no. Some of the errors you make are minor and can be repaired. Like the first we set off, we had like plastic plates and forks and spoons and knives. And after the first food drop, we're like, we are never using these plates. We're just using a little Sierra cup, you know, or some bowl. So some stuff was mistakes that we just could fix by getting rid of it. That's a shirt I've never worn and I'm never going to wear it. One of the biggest single problems, I don't know if it was a mistake, but it was a problem, was food. So we didn't have enough food for 3 people. And it was interesting. So Townsend, as I mentioned, TZ, had a couple times where he left the trip for a week to recuperate. And when we had 3 people's worth of food split among 2 people, we were pretty good. But when we had 3 people eating 3 people's worth of food, we were rationing. Like dinners are usually okay, but breakfasts were small, and lunches, you know, we've got like the bag of prunes and the bag of almonds or whatever. We would have at some point, we're like, okay, you get 4 prunes, you get 10 almonds, because we're trying to make those bags last for the next week. So we didn't have enough food. And the question for me is, was it a mistake, or is that something you're inherently going to bump up against? Like we needed to carry 5 or 10 days of food with us. And yet that's a lot of weight. You know, if your pack is already, you know, even without food, your pack is 55 or 60 pounds, and then you're adding on food and you might have another 15 pounds of food. You're trying to make these decisions. Do I carry more food, or do I just suck it up and go hungry a little bit? And luckily, you know, we're out in the woods, but we weren't in the middle of Alaska with no towns. You know, we did bump into towns. We occasionally would hitchhike down to get, you know, if we were running low on supplies, we could hitchhike to a close by town. We did that a couple times. Or one time we bumped into some campers. They were in their Winnebago, kind of on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. And they're like, do you guys want any food? And our friend Townsend said, we're not highway beggars. And Dave and I said, yes, we are. So we, you know, they were giving us cans of soup and sandwiches, and we were pretty happy to have them.
Other questions, guys? I still have like lots more. Go ahead, Greg.
Was there ever a time, like, as you near the 5 or 6 month mark, that you felt you were behind schedule or falling behind, or wouldn't be able to get there on time?
Yeah, I think luckily we didn't encounter that. We had made all these little milestones to get to different interim spots, different food resupplies, or to meet up with friends. So we weren't behind schedule throughout the trip. We were behind schedule for half a day or a day, and then we'd make that up and get to the next spot. So we kept to our master schedule by making short little adjustments, as opposed to like falling days and days or weeks behind. So when we got to Canada, it was within a day of when we thought we'd get to Canada. And part of the reason we started in March and ended at the end of August was because we thought Townsend would be able to stay a little longer. It turned out his grad program started in mid-August, so he had to leave early. And Dave, he ended up starting a graduate school program in University of Montana at Missoula in about the 10th of September. So we kind of planned the trip to end by the 1st of September so that Dave and Townsend could start their graduate programs, which meant that we kind of calculated backwards from that, and we had to start the trip on March 10th, which ideally is not, you don't want to start that early. It wasn't so bad for New Mexico, but when we got to Colorado, you saw all those shots in the snow, and going through deep snow is really slow. And the later it gets into the season, like May or June, it's melted down, and if it freezes at night, it'll get crusty and it's easy to walk on it. But there were some days where we're like post holing, where your foot just goes into the snow, sinks in a foot or two, and that's really slow going. So short answer is we didn't get behind, but because of finishing when we did, we had to start, I think, a month earlier than you would optimally want to start. And that's interesting. If any of you contemplate a short trip or a long trip, the seasons you do it are really important, right? Picking weeks where the temperatures won't be too high, where there won't be too much snow, some of those, and it's different for every elevation, right? If you're hiking at a really high elevation, you're probably going to want to go in July, August, September, when it's not snowy in the Sierras or in the Rockies. But if you're planning a desert trip, totally don't go in July. Plan a trip in March or April when it's going to be higher water and cooler temperatures. So sorry, I answered 3 questions you didn't ask, but hopefully I answered the one you did.
Bart, I have 2 more questions. Other than Colorado, had you hiked any of the areas prior to your trip? And then after the trip, you said you've gone back to a few places like Glacier and maybe some other places. What can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was in a Boy Scout troop. Nate and I were both in Troop 78, just down the block from where I am. And through that, we had done some backpacking, both in Colorado, but I'd actually been on a trip to Glacier Park. I'd been to Glacier once as like a junior in high school. And that's the first time I saw a grizzly bear. It was really far away from us. But yeah, Glacier, as an example, was a place I had seen and thought was amazing and thought would be really fun to go back to. And we were actually deciding on our trip whether to start south and go north or start north and go south, because you can do that. And it turned out for a couple of reasons we had to do south to north. But it was really wonderful to think about ending our trip in Glacier Park. It is totally like the capstone of the trip, an amazing place with wildlife and beautiful peaks and all that. So I'd seen some of the territory, but not much of it. To be honest, most of this, like I had been to New Mexico maybe once, maybe never. Wyoming was pretty much unknown to me, like the Wind River Range, never been there before this trip. But as a result of the trip, as I said, yeah, you're going through some places, and not every place do you want to go back to, like the Red Desert. It's beautiful, but it's pretty stark. And so, I've been back there only driving through it, but there are places in Colorado, in New Mexico, and certainly in Wyoming and the Wind River Range, the ones with all the mosquitoes. I've been back there like 6 or 8 times, and it's spectacular. And we've gone, my wife and I have gone at times of the year when there aren't as many mosquitoes, because that's the only downside of the winds is the mosquitoes. Everything else about it is amazing. And so we go in like late August, early September, when it's already frozen, at least a couple nights below zero or below freezing, and the mosquitoes get knocked down. I've been back to Glacier one other time since then for a friend's wedding. And some of those other places, it's interesting. I haven't gone back just on the divide, but I've gone to like, wilderness areas and places near the divide. But the other key piece, sorry, you didn't ask this question, but because I live in the West and because I work on natural resource issues, kind of water rights and land, I have done some traveling for work and other vacations, and you end up crossing over the Continental Divide a lot, right? It's kind of this big feature if you're driving east to west or west to east. And so there's a lot of places that I revisited just in the form of I'm on a highway and I'm like driving by, I'm like, oh, there's a sign for the Continental Divide. And, maybe even see a person who's got a backpack on, who's doing the same trip I did 30 years later.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, go ahead, Greg. Go ahead.
How did you get back from the Canadian border?
Great question. Those are really important questions. How are you going to get down to Mexico, which is 500 miles away? A family friends took us down there. Dave's father and his uncle gave us a ride. And when we got to Montana, we did not, or when we got to Canada, we did not have a game plan. We kind of knew that no one was going to meet us, and we knew we didn't have any money to like rent a car or anything like that. So we hitchhiked, and we hitchhiked all the way back to Boulder, which is about 1,000 miles. And I'll give you the short story. The first day we had 5 different hitchhikes. They were all terrible. 2 of the people were actually drunk, and we figured that out once we're in the car, and we're like, okay, pull over. we're gonna just wait till the next car comes. So we had 5 different hitchhikes, and we only got about 150 miles. The next morning, we're up in a place called Great Falls, Montana, and we're on the major interstate highway, which is usually a terrible place to hitchhike. And I don't expect any of you have hitchhiked, and you probably shouldn't. It's not as common as it was back in the 70s. And I'm told, I wasn't around then, but the 70s had a lot of hitchhiking. But it was still happening back in the 90s. But we were on the interstate in Great Falls, Montana. We're sticking out our thumb, and this converted school bus, right, like a mini school bus, comes by, and the woman yells out, "Stay there, I'm coming back." And she had to go down, 5 miles to the next exit, turn around. She comes by. It's a woman who said, "Where are you headed?" And we said, "Colorado." And she said, "Where in Colorado?" It turns out she was driving to Boulder, my hometown, where both Dave and I lived. And it took us 2 days, like full on just driving with her with no more hitchhiking. It took us 2 days to get back, but that was like the most magical hitchhike we've ever had. Turns out she was enrolling in a course and starting, that September, starting in a new massage program or something, and just wonderful woman. So that's how we got back. Magical hitchhike, which again, I don't recommend. It's not a reliable way to get across the country.
I was going to ask about your reentry, or like what was like to finish? Was it kind of euphoric, or was it like I'm ready to be done? And then the whole process of kind of getting back into society, what was that like? I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I think at the end of 6 months, yeah, you're definitely getting a little tired of it, especially on those days where it's rainy. In Glacier Park, like half of the time we're there, it was just pouring down rain. It was not the best hiking in the world. And then the other half was like pretty spectacular. But things are, your gear's breaking down a little bit, your body's breaking down a little. But it was mostly a bittersweet, it was both like happy it's over, happy we're done, we accomplished it. It was also a little sad, like, oh, well, guess I have to go back and do whatever it is I'm going to do with the rest of my life. I think for Dave and Townsend, it was easier because they had a reentry to go right into graduate school with a very formal, like, okay, I'm going to go to class and I'm going to teach as a TA, or what they had plans. I didn't have a reentry plan. Like, I got back to Boulder. I find that I'm strong, but running, which I used to do my whole life, I couldn't run very well because my legs hadn't been running. They'd been building up different muscles. So 3 days after I got back, a good buddy, he invited me to come work on the farm. He was a foreman on a vegetable farm. He said, "Why don't you come and pick corn and sell vegetables?" And it turned out to be a really good way to reenter society because it was outdoors all day. I'm making a little bit of money. I'm starting to interact with people a little bit more. But it was kind of like almost like camping, working out in the corn patch and the squash patch. And then longer term, you do kind of have to go back, or you don't have to, but if you're going to go back and sleep under a roof and integrate, I stayed with my parents for another few months. Eventually got a job. Eventually went to graduate school, went to law school, and the beautiful thing about doing this trip, and this is one of the takeaways for all of you, like there's a great time in your life. Right now is a great time, to explore, go camping, go with friends, go on a week-long trip. And there'll be some time, if you're taking a gap year, or if after college you haven't quite decided what you're going to do with the rest of your life, there'll be times like this in your 20s, in your early and mid 20s, where I think it's a really good time to just experiment, do something, because you don't have a full-time job, you don't have necessarily a family that needs you. Maybe if you're planning on having kids, maybe you haven't had kids yet. There's this moment where you can do some stuff that's a little out of the ordinary, and it's a pretty good time to do it. So yeah, integrating back into society took some time, but I was lucky to kind of have farming as a midway.
Great.
Have you met anyone else that has done the same thing from the Mexican border to the Canadian border?
Yeah, it actually has become pretty popular. So maybe some of you have read or heard about the movie Wild, right? There was a film version of it, I think had Reese Witherspoon, and there's the book version. And that's a woman who did the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. Actually, she made it up to the border with Oregon and Washington. I think in part because of that book, and in part because of the outdoor industry, like camping, backpacking is a pretty popular thing today, and more so than it was 30 years ago. There's a lot of people doing these trails. The Appalachian Trail, which runs from Georgia up to Maine, the Continental Divide Trail, which goes from New Mexico to Montana and up into Canada, and then the Pacific Crest, which runs up California, Oregon, and Washington. Those all get a lot more people. I think I've seen the numbers, and there's actually somebody kept a website of the Continental Divide folks. Prior to when we went in 1990, there's probably only a couple dozen people who had done it. So not very many. And today there's a couple dozen every year. And the Continental Divide Trail is by far the least of the three trails as far as popularity. The Appalachian Trail has literally several thousand people a year that do the Appalachian Trail. Very popular, a little easier in the sense it's very hilly. It's not easy hiking, but you're closer to towns. So you can do much shorter food. You have a 3-day food supply, 5 days, and you can go into town and get resupplied. The Pacific Crest is kind of in the middle. It's not as popular as the Appalachian, not nearly as scarce the number of hikers as the Continental Divide. So Pacific Crest Trail is probably somewhere in the middle with a few hundred people a year. So it's become, short story, it's become more popular. And it probably, I think the pandemic year was probably a pretty big year for hiking, because people were like, nothing going on here, I'm stuck at home. I don't know that for a fact, but I think there was a great uptick in outdoor activity generally, and probably in long hikes in particular.
We saw you taking a journal with lots of notes. Do you ever reread through those, or like looking through the slides in the last couple of days? How often do you do that?
Yeah, I'm really glad I kept the journal. I can't tell you right now where it is, but I know that I have it. And we did take at least a page of longhand notes every day. My buddy Dave, who I mentioned a lot, he lost his journal somehow. And one of the things I need to do is just photocopy or scan mine for him. But I don't go back and review it very often. I have a couple times in the last 30 years. I've gone back and peeked at either sections of it, an area we hiked through, or just skimmed parts. I'm not sure I read it start to finish, but I did. Yeah, took pretty meticulous notes. And I'm not really a journaling person. Like the only time I really take any notes or try to write poetry or draw or anything is when I'm out in the woods. So I don't take journals at a daily thing at home like some people do. But I'm really glad I did take it. And what I didn't review this before the slideshow, and so maybe it showed, because I probably didn't have all the names and memories at my fingertips. But the December Christmas time, right after the trip, so back in 1990, I wrote like a little 6-page tiny noveletta, which was trying to capture a lot of what we saw and heard. And I threw in some quotes from people who we had met on the trail, and I put in some details about how far we hiked and all. If we took the last hour and kind of put it into 4 pages. I put all that together and gave it out to friends and family as a gift. And that's, I didn't rely on that as a source for today, but that's something that's a pretty good summary of what happened. I'm certainly open for more questions. I know you have more time. I just wanted to make sure, Nate, I think you asked me to answer the question, and I may have already done this indirectly, but I think it's interesting how people approach hiking, outdoor activity generally, but hiking and long distance hiking, they can come at it from a whole bunch of different angles. Like you can get it can be just luck that a friend invites you. That's kind of what happened to me. You can be attracted to the athletic challenge or the logistics, like you really like planning and you like, today I know people that do the Colorado Trail and they weigh out their food. They're like, I need exactly 2,500 calories a day, and I'm going to get it through, this much peanut butter and this much cracker. And they weigh out and prepackage everything. They love planning. Some people will do this because they love nature, and there's like no better way to get out in nature than get on a trail where you can see, maybe you'll see some wild animals. I didn't put too many of those slides in there, but we saw lots of critters like weasels and grouse, and we saw a couple rattlesnakes. Almost stepped on one. But you might do it because you really love plants or animals, or you just love nature. And one of the things that I ended up doing this, I didn't know that I was doing this when I did it. Right, I took the trip more or less because I liked the idea of the challenge and the athletic. It would be difficult, and I didn't know if I could do it. That was kind of the really interesting thing for me, is tackling something so big that you don't even know that you can do it. But I ended up seeing a lot of natural resource use. I saw logging trucks. I saw places in New Mexico where the town we thought we'd be getting to for a resupply turned out to be completely gone. Like the mining company had bought the town, moved everyone away, and dug a giant pit. I mean, I saw a lot of those natural resource extractive industries. I saw dams, I saw pipelines, and that for me led me to get more interested in that. And so when I went to law school, I definitely focused on natural resources law. I studied with people who wrote textbooks about water law and public land grazing and forest cutting, tree cutting. So for me, it ended up being kind of the window on the world that I kind of used going forward when I decided, well, what am I going to do with my life? So part of the reason I went to graduate school in law was I saw it as an avenue to help manage some of the natural resources. So that's an example of, like, you might go into a trip with some ideas or preconceptions of why you're doing it. And then, things are going to happen, and you're going to get exposed to things you didn't even know that you're interested in. One last takeaway I wanted just to pass along, just as a I think encouragement, or as you guys hike this week, as you think about maybe hiking trips this summer or next year, the one really spectacular thing about hiking compared to driving or flying or any other kind of form of transit, it's at a really slow pace, which has both positives and negatives, right? If you really want to get someplace fast, you're probably not going to hike there. You're going to take your bike or your motorcycle or your car, you're going to fly. But being out there exposed to the world, like, it's just you. And if it rains, you're going to get wet. And if it freezes, you're going to get cold. You're exposed. And that was a really interesting thing, because people are very attracted to or curious about you. And so it was amazing how literally every day somebody would be like, what are you guys doing? Wow, that sounds interesting. It would make them tell a story about a hiking trip they took 20 years before, or tell them about their grandkid and how they loved hiking with him. And as I showed a couple examples, they would meet us and they'd say, hey, do you need a place to sleep? Or do you need some food? And our answer was usually, yeah, we'd love to have a place to sleep inside. And so people, it was unbelievable how that was so common. It wasn't like we had to go knocking on doors and beg people to stay in their house. They were like coming to us because we are kind of this weird, we're crossing the landscape with this giant pack on our back. We're doing a fairly unusual thing, and it just, people came out of the woodwork. So that's one thing I think you're inevitably going to bump into people when you're hiking or backpacking. That they'll approach you and encounter you in different ways than you ever imagined.
Awesome. Any other questions out there? Well, that was great, Bart. Thanks for your time. And,
sure.
I, for one, enjoyed hearing it, even though I've heard it before, but I learned. So that was super cool, and we appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
You're super welcome. Hey, thanks. I hope you guys have a really fun week. I hope you get tired. I hope you sleep well, and I hope you avoid injuries. So thanks a lot. I'm gonna hop off.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Bart.
All right. Go Sage Hill Lightning.